A transgender teenager was found dead in a park in Warrington on Saturday. 16-year-old Brianna Ghey was stabbed to death. 2 suspects have been arrested, both 15, a boy and a girl, in connection to the killing. Quite quickly, this tragedy was leapt on, weaponized, I think it's fair to say. There have been vigils come protests. I mean, immediately it's been folded into the culture wars. And pretty much anyone apart from the suspects, it seems, is to blame for this death. If you go by what's being written on Twitter, Tom, what have you made of that kind of response?
I thought it's been stomach turning, really. I mean, what you have here is a horrible tragedy of alleged murder, which has befallen a family, and yet you can almost hear people kind of rubbing their hands with. I hate to put it like that, but you can almost feel people rubbing their hands with glee as soon as they saw this, because they thought it could be folded into the culture war, because they thought, here we have something that we can use to bash people that we disagree with on questions of gender recognition reform in Scotland, or on questions of the gender debate more broadly. I mean, almost immediately, quite prominent people in the kind of trans activist set were explicitly saying that Westminster had blood on their hands. There was a piece in The Independent, which I thought was absolutely shameful, which essentially said, we don't yet know if anti-trans hate is a part of this story. The police, it's still an area of investigation. It's not been closed, but at the same time, it's not been confirmed or reported on. But, and then it's just, we couldn't help but feel that this was coming, and that since the Tory leadership race to the gender recognition discussion to this to that, these people have blood in their hands, and this keeps happening. And I think where you basically have some sort of horrendous killing, tragedy, atrocity, whatever, and it's just very quickly weaponized, basically to the ends of, I dislike this person in public life, politics, I'm going to blame them because they've expressed a reasonable concern that vaguely relates to this issue. The fact that in this case, again, no kind of anti-trans hate component has been located hasn't stopped it in any way, shape or form, which makes it even more shameless. But at the same time, I think it also just speaks to the fact that it almost everything gets swallowed up by the culture, or even these kind of very particular human tragedies. You know, there's no restraint. And obviously, when we talk about the culture, well, a lot of important issues are bound up in that. But I guess what I'm getting at is to say that there's a lot of discussion these days about how people weaponize certain issues, about the mean-spiritedness of, say, our side of a lot of these discussions and so on. But I see no equivalent in mainstream political discourse to the sort of behaviour that we've seen in recent days when it comes to this, to people who, as soon as they see an atrocity like this, just their almost immediate reaction is to use a dead body as a soapbox, and that is deeply unpleasant. And I think people should be called out for doing that.
And it's come offline as well. I mean, we can look at a clip now of people at a vigil for Brianna Ghey making their feelings known about Keir Starmer.
Fuck Keir Starmer! Fuck Keir Starmer!
Essentially, Ella, Keir Starmer is being accused of having blood on his hands because he's not completely 100% on board with self-ID for 16-year-olds. I mean, what does that say about the kind of level of debate where things have, how low have things sunk?
And it's also, I mean, he's also been accused of being complicit because he hadn't at that point in the vigil said anything about the alleged murder of Brianna Ghey. And it's it has echoes of the whole kind of silence is violence argument from the murder of George Floyd. In fact, actually, a lot of the some of the signs and some of the chants at that vigil were very similar. So there was a kind of lots of people saying, say her name, which was something that came out of a kind of Black Lives Matter movement around some of the police killings in America. And it's just so incredibly unspecific. There is nothing really, as I can see it, that would obviously have like the proviso that we don't know anything, but it seems bizarre that you would find a link between the killing of George Floyd and the killing of this trans school teenager. And, there's something, as Tom says, really sort of worrying about it and really distasteful. I mean, on a human level, this is a child that's been killed, and parents who don't have their child anymore, and that's a terrible thing. And there's been the sort of a row online about how this is being reported, and obviously the family want to stay true to how Brianna described herself and called herself, they use she, her pronouns and all that kind of thing. But at the same time, there is this sort of slight difficulty with, I was listening to the radio and it was reported that a schoolgirl had been killed. And obviously that's inaccurate. And so it's one of those, issues that I think most sensible people say, okay, let's not have our kind of Twitter row about pronouns. Let's not have our Twitter row about or about the kind of gender reform bill. Someone's been killed, but as Tom says, some people never rest, and there is just it can be incredibly sort of difficult to find yourself constantly defending yourself as a good person when you're, a commentator who's talking about, or someone, anyone who thinks that very normal things that, people should be able to live however they want to live and respectfully and with freedom and all the rest of it, but just not pretend that sex isn't real, it's like you're sort of begging, just let me I'll give you everything you want, but just let me stay in reality here. I think we really have to be careful to not let the sort of demonization of I want to say not gender critical side, just the sort of the side of most people whose heart breaks for that family, but at the same time is not going to be cowed into silence on the base. And we've had this, similarly with sort of, the whole kind of argument around suicide rates of trans people. And, it basically what it boils down to is shut up or we'll claim that you are murderous and have blood on your hands. Moving forward, any kind of broader discussions about the gender wars, I don't think should be cowed by incidents like this.
Yeah, it essentially seems that, as we were talking about in Scotland earlier, the kind of gender ideology argument has been pretty comprehensively trashed when it's been discussed rationally, when it's been discussed in the courts or in sort of parliamentary settings, when it's discussed at the higher political level. So now we have to turn to this kind of emotional blackmail almost. That seems to be is that why they've leapt on it with such glee? I think
that's part, and even just moving away from this particular tragedy as well, I think you do start to see some of the more prominent people on the other side of this argument are becoming increasingly over the top and true. I mean, even with Nicola Sturgeon, we saw a kind of example of this where when she was really on the back foot, when again she was kind of dealing with brickbats left, right and centre, when her whole argument on authority was unravelling. She does the basket of deplorables thing. She calls everyone, they're not just transphobes, they're often homophobic. Some of them are even racist. There's a certain individual I won't name who's been going around recently likening gender critical women to the KKK because they were also people who protect women was their, again, in their case, much more devious kind of, way of prosecuting their particular bigoted argument. These are not arguments you make when you're winning. These are not shameful tactics that you deploy if you're actually, on the right side of history, and most people in the country recognise this. So I think the more, as you suggest, that the gender ideology argument is kind of defeated in public or has certain setbacks at least, the lower some of the more prominent activists in this tend to sink. But I think it might again shame some people into keeping quiet on certain things here or there, and that's regrettable. But I think in general, it just continues to display that for all their claims to be incredibly morally virtuous, that's not really what's going on here with this particular campaign.
And one thing it is worth pointing out the fact that, tragedies like the Brianna Ghey one are mercifully rare. That it's good news that there isn't mass killings of trans people, as is often claimed. In fact, before Brianna Ghey, the last trans person in Great Britain to be killed was in 2019. Roughly, if you take into account the size of the trans population, a regular, everyday person is slightly more likely to be murdered. So, these claims of victimhood seem to be all that there is, in a sense. That seems to be the argument. Trans people suffer, therefore we must bend reality to it, and it's not appropriate.
Well, a similar thing happened when Sarah Everard was murdered, which is that there's a real tendency, a kind of macabre tendency to jump on something, an incident that happens like that and extrapolate from it to try and make some kind of broader political and moral point. the first thing I thought when I heard it is, well, allegedly that you potentially have the situation in which kids are killing each other. What's going on there? I mean, that's for a whole nother podcast. But there's, and the same thing happened with the Sarah Everard murder. There was this kind of huge discussion about sort of women's safety and broad, allegations made about patriarchy and misogyny, and then it turns out to be a very specific case of a specific police officer, and actually kind of discussions about consent classes had absolutely nothing to do with it. Who knows whether that will be the case here? We wait to see what the police find out, but they're just you should be ashamed of yourself if you think that there is political sort of battles to be won off the back of people being killed, particularly when we don't know anything yet.